Okay, so we're obviously a little bit behind, but rest assured you guys will have the time that you need to speak. So our next speaker, this is obviously the start of session 3. Lisa Fazio is an assistant professor of psychology at Vanderbilt University. She received her graduate degree from Duke University in 2010 and completed postdocs at Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Fazio's research focuses on how children and adults learn new information, both true and false, and how to correct errors in people's knowledge. Dr. Fazio will discuss how background knowledge might not protect us against false information. Please welcome Dr. Lisa Fazio.
Thanks, Eric. So I'm going to kind of quickly go through about 5 experiments, but I feel way better about it because Ruth went through like 10. So 5 is going to feel like nothing now. So I'm going to talk about this kind of larger question of how do we determine if something is true or if it's false. So when we're presented with information, what do we do in order to make this judgment? You might think that what we do is consult our background knowledge and make kind of this informed decision. Oh, I've got a lot of knowledge about this. This is definitely true. Or I know this fact that contradicts it, and it's actually false. But in fact, there's a lot of evidence that what we do instead is rely on heuristics such as fluency and repetition and use those instead. So the classic result of this is the illusory truth effect. So this was first shown by Hasher and colleagues in 1977. They gave people some statements twice, other statements they had only seen once, and then asked them to judge how true they were. And the statements that participants had seen twice were given higher truth ratings than the statements that they were seeing for the first time. This happened for both true and false facts. Just seeing them twice made them feel more true to the participants. So some evidence that what's really going on here is that when you see a statement for the second time, you're able to process it more fluently, understand it more easily, and that we kind of misinterpret that ease as a signal for truth. So some further evidence of that is a study by Rieger and Schwartz, where they got some sentences in kind of high contrast fonts, some sentences in more difficult to read low contrast fonts. You think that this top statement is more true than the bottom statement. It's easier to process, you process it more fluently, you give it a higher truth rating. But one thing that we noticed in the literature was that people tend to use stimuli that are kind of plausible but unknown. So we're going to do a little quiz. I don't have my notes up here, so I'm going to try and remember the correct answers to the quiz. I think I know them. So just yell out whether you think the statements are true or false. French horn players get cash bonuses to stay in the U.S. Army. True or false?
False.
That one is true. In fact, I recently checked it because I was like, yeah, maybe you did in the 70s, but you don't anymore. You still get a couple of grand if you are a French horn player. No, there's like 5 or 6 specific instruments that get the bonus. Lithium is the lightest of all metals. Come on, no one's guessing now. That one is also true. The People's Republic of China was founded in 1947. That one is false. And Zachary Taylor was the first president to die in office.
True.
That one is also false. So you can see all of these statements share this commonality in that they seem like they could be true, but you're unlikely to actually have the knowledge to say whether they're true or false. And there was kind of this bias in the literature to suggest that this illusory truth effect would only happen when we don't have that prior knowledge. And so we decided to test that. So what we did was use both known and unknown statements. So known or unknown here was based first on norms. So known statements were things that about 70% of participants could answer correctly in question form. unknown statements about 5%. So you either see the true statement, a kilt is the short pleated skirt worn by men in Scotland, or a false statement, a sari is the short pleated skirt worn by men in Scotland. And the question really was, would this illusory truth effect also happen for these known falsehoods, where you've got the correct background knowledge, but I'm presenting you with a false statement? So first you get an exposure bias, so you see half of the statements. You're just asked how interesting are the facts. We tell them that we're kind of pilot testing materials for a new study. Then in the truth phase, you now see all of the statements, so half of them you've seen earlier, half of them you're seeing for the first time. And you're asked how true or false does the statement appear to you? 1 being definitely false, 6 being definitely true. And so here, half of them are new, half of them are old, half are true, half are false, half are known, half are unknown. Then we also, at the end, added in this knowledge check so that we could see what participants' actual knowledge was. So for each statement, they got it in terms of a multiple choice question. In what city was Louis Armstrong born? New Orleans, Memphis, or I don't know. So this allows us to then sort statements, not just based on the norms, but also based on what they actually said in this knowledge check. So here it is, sorted by demonstrated knowledge. So the unknown statements here are the ones that they gave the wrong answer or said, I don't know, whereas the known statements are just the ones that they were able to answer that question correctly. And you can see that both of them still show this illusory truth effect. These are just the falsehoods reported here. True statements, you end up at a ceiling effect, especially for known true statements, like you already knew it was true, you can't really go any farther. So these are just falsehoods. So for falsehoods that contradict things that you already know, you still think they're more true the second time you've heard them. So when you hear that sari is the skirt that Scottish men wear, twice you think it's more true. Just for completeness, you get the same pattern if instead I sort it by estimated knowledge, by the norms, rather than demonstrated knowledge on the knowledge check. But you can see that the difference between known and unknown is less because it's not individual people's knowledge. So this led us to wonder kind of how are people making these judgments? And you can imagine kind of two different ways. One would be that we first consult our prior knowledge, and then only if that knowledge search fails do we then rely on these heuristics like fluency. Or it could be that fluency is the primary process, and it's only once we've discounted or decided not to use that fluency or it's not processed fluently that we then consult the knowledge base. So the knowledge conditional would be that you do the knowledge search first, fluency conditional, that you first do this fluency check. So we came up with two different multinomial models to represent this. So this is the knowledge conditional model. So this is that with probability k, you're able to retrieve your knowledge and then you respond accurately. Or with probability 1 minus k, you don't retrieve knowledge, and then with probability f, you rely on fluency and respond true. Or with probability 1 minus f, you don't rely on fluency, and then we've just got a guessing parameter for guessing true or false. Contrary, the fluency conditional model says that the primary process is this fluency, so you either rely on fluency or do not, and it's only at the times that you don't rely on fluency that you then either do or do not retrieve your knowledge. So in order to test these two models, we ran a second experiment, which is exactly the same, except for now it's a binary decision. So you're deciding if a statement is true or not true. The modeling is done on counts, and so it just makes everything easier. You get the same results, even when you're now doing this true, not true rating. So this is the proportion of statements rated true. And you can see that both for the unknown and known statements, you think you're more likely to say that it is true if it's been repeated versus if you're seeing it for the first time. When we actually do the modeling, the knowledge dominant model does not fit the data, whereas the fluency dominant model fits it quite well. Modeling is weird in that you want a non-statistically significant result. So for students or anyone in the audience who's like, why are you selecting that one? That's what you do. So not only did the fluency dominant model fit the data, it also provides parameter estimates that make sense. So the fluency parameter is higher for repeated statements than new statements. So you're more likely to rely on fluency if it's been repeated. You have more knowledge, you're more likely to rely on your knowledge when it's known versus unknown, and then we constrain the guessing parameter to be similar across all of them. One thing to note is it's still, most of the time you're getting to that knowledge check. You're still relying on your knowledge for most of the statements. It's just that the primary process is either relying or not relying on fluency. But those fluency parameters are all less than 50%. Most of the time you're still getting down to that knowledge. So we find that prior knowledge does not protect against illusory truth effects, and that people may inappropriately rely on fluency even when they have relevant knowledge. And this goes back to this idea of knowledge neglect, which was lovely presented in the talk before, which is that in many situations we find that people have this prior knowledge, but they fail to use it in the current situation. So even though we know that that knowledge exists, they're not using it in this relevant situation. So this led us to this next question of what could we do to either reduce or eliminate this effect? Is there anything you can do so that people won't think that repeated statements are more likely to be true? There's some recent evidence in a paper that's actually still under review that implausible statements, really super implausible statements, similar to the ones that have been used before, don't show the same illusory truth effect. So when the statement is a single elephant weighs less than a single ant, then as you can see on the left, people think it's false immediately. They also think it's false if they've seen it twice. So some evidence for some constraints to this process. Although I also would like to point out that the mean here is not exactly 1. It's like 1 point something, which makes you wonder a little bit about some of the distance and stuff. But what we decided to do was look at something that people could do as they're making the truth judgment. So what we actually did was have them explain why they thought the statement was true or false. So same exposure phase. So now in the truth phase, you either do the control, which is the same truth judgment as before, or this explain condition, where for each statement you have to first say, how do you know that the statement is true or false? And then you give us your truth rating. So we just had participants type in as much or as little as they wanted to. What we find first is in the control condition, we replicate our previous findings. So even for known falsehoods, repeated statements are judged to be more true than the new statements. But in this explain condition, this effect is much reduced if not eliminated. So when we get people to think about their prior knowledge, think about why this statement might be true or false, then they're much less likely to rely on this fluency. We wanted to replicate this. We also wanted to replicate it with that knowledge check. So that was just done on the kind of estimated norms. We wanted to again show that this happens even when you know that you definitely got this prior knowledge. We also wanted to give that knowledge check as a pre-test instead of a post-test so that it happened before any manipulation. So in this study, participants were given the knowledge check. Then 2 weeks later, they did the actual experiment where they, again, were either in the control or the explanation condition. So we again find that even when we're dealing with demonstrated knowledge, so these are the statements sorted by that knowledge check, again, known falsehoods are judged to be more true when you've seen them twice. But again, that effect is reduced when we have them explain why they think that the statements are true or false. led us to the question of what's going on here. Is it that participants are switching kind of which model they're using, and now they're relying on knowledge first before they get to the fluency judgment, or is it just making them less likely to rely on fluency? So we did a third experiment, again now with the binary true, not true decision, so that we could check our models. Again, in the control condition, repetition has an effect, even for known falsehoods, but again reduced when we have that explanations. When we actually did the modeling, again, the knowledge-conditional model didn't fit the data, but the fluency-conditional model does. So it's not that when we're getting them to explain, they're now switching what type of model they're using. They're not now making the primary decision about knowledge. They're still making the primary decision about relying on fluency, but they're now more likely to not rely on fluency and instead retrieve knowledge. So these are the parameter estimates. Here's in the control condition. So you're more likely to rely on fluency for repeated than for new. You have more knowledge for easy than for hard. And you've got the stable guessing parameter. In the explain condition, we're able to hold everything else constant. The only thing that has to change are those initial fluency parameters, where for both new and repeated items, you're now less likely to rely on fluency. So it's basically just making you less likely to rely on these heuristics and more likely to rely on other decision-making processes. So we find that repetition increases perceived truth even when the statement contradicts prior knowledge, but this doesn't always occur. So for these really completely implausible statements, you don't see the effect, and also when we get people to actually think about what they know, then you don't see it. And so pausing to think and consult our knowledge base can help reduce the reliance on processing fluency. So thank you very much.
Okay, let's open up the questions.
Thanks. So it seems like you're showing that people are super rational, from my point of view, and very, very Bayesian, because you should neglect truth if there's lots of evidence. In this case, the evidence is just repetition, and you should be more likely to revise it prior if you have more. At least the same evidence repeated by at different times with different people. So that one makes sense. It also makes sense that if your prior is very strong, you have high confidence, so less to do it. And it also makes sense.
But we don't actually find that if your prior is strong, you're less likely to do it. The repetition effect is equally strong for the falsehoods that contradict your prior knowledge and the falsehoods that don't.
Oh, but if they're very unprobable, okay?
Right.
So if something's very unprobable, that means my prior is much more strong.
Right, but on that, I'm saying that it's not a continuum there, because when you have more or less knowledge up until that completely implausible, then you're not sensitive to it.
But and then the last thing is, if you ask people to think about it, they would retrieve more evidence. The evidence only comes within after that, and so now you have more evidence than prior, and so the effect of the repetition will be smaller. So
Yeah,
that's great. I mean, I think it just really fits. It's really how people should think.
I guess I don't know if people should revise their prior that quickly. That just seeing something that contradicts your prior knowledge twice should affect you. That seems like a really fast switch.
Affect you more. Like what you're saying, repetition versus knowledge. So it should affect you more, right?
Right, but seeing it twice versus once, I don't think that doesn't seem like that should be enough to make me now think that saris are the skirts that Scottish men wear. I've presumably heard that true statement many, 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 many times.
Just just a quick question about like your experimental design. So, like, what's your y-axis on the graphs? Like, what are you actually asking people? Are you asking them how sure are you that this is true, or like how true is this?
So it is either is this statement true, not true, or in the other where it's the continuous ratings, it's how true or false does this statement appear to you. 1, definitely false. 2, probably false, somewhat true, probably false, true, definitely true.
Okay, cool, thanks. That's it.
So I was wondering, is this something that's like well known enough that we see this sort of thing exploited in advertisements and in propaganda? And like, how does it show up in the world, and what are the consequences there?
Yeah, so whether or not advertisers and politicians officially know it under this title of the illusory truth effect, I think they are aware of this general finding that if you repeat things, people think that they're more true. So you'll often see both groups just continuing to state their position with the idea that it'll then become more true. I think this has a big role in some misinformation and even conspiracy theory things. The first time that you hear about Pizzagate, it seems wildly, incredibly crazy. But every time you keep hearing about it, it's going to start to seem slightly more and more plausible. And that might be one way that these beliefs creep in.
2 quick clarificatory questions.
Yeah.
In the canon anecdote brand, how many repetitions were there for those statements? Were there repetitions?
It was just 1 versus 2.
It was just 1 versus 2, and that raised it only a little bit for.
It didn't raise it at all for the implausible statements. For the control statements, they saw the typical effect, but for those 4 really implausible ones, they didn't.
And what was the time difference between the presentation 1 and presentation 2?
It was similar to all of my studies here, where it's kind of immediately.
And in your model, you had at the end the 50% chance for guessing true and guessing false.
No, it's about 20% guess true, and there is.
Yeah, wait, no. Yeah, I just mean. So yeah, what's the probability of guessing true versus guessing false for those who are not retrieving enough?
If they don't retrieve knowledge 21% of the time, they guess true, and the rest of the time they guess false.
Do you think this has anything to do with like propensity to second guess ourselves rather than like a belief that somebody has? So if somebody's repeating information, are they just thinking to themselves, well, maybe I don't actually know, or they start to like second guess their own information, even if they would be quite confident that they were true, that it was true in another circumstance where they weren't pushed?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea that maybe what's going on here is kind of, once you've seen it multiple times, you're kind of disbelieving that you knew it initially. I think that's one part of what could be going on here.
So just on that point, I mean, one thing that you could do in when you're measuring your knowledge is then ask them the certainty, how certain are they? That they know, that they got the answer right? That might moderate some of this potentially. My question though is, so in the case where you have them explain why it's true or false, you still find that fluency is the dominant decision and then they override that and go to knowledge. But what do you think that the explanation is doing? So it's changing their view of the information in some way. It's not knowledge, because knowledge is still secondary in the process. So what do you think is happening with the explanation that's making them override the dominant?
I think what it's doing is forcing them not to rely on these heuristics. So one interesting thing is that the size of the effect doesn't depend on kind of how good your explanation is.
Okay, I was going to ask you if you coded them.
Yeah, so we've coded them. So this is how we coded them, whether they kind of said, I'm just unsure, it just feels right or wrong, I just know it. if they gave an actual correction, so they said what the correct answer was, I knew it in school, I knew it from experience, someone told me, I heard it from the media, or one or two people said kind of they heard it in this experiment. The most common ones were correction and kind of unsure, just feels right. And then we did some analyses comparing kind of the, and it just feels right, I'm unsure about it ones to the ones where they had some real knowledge, like correction, school experience, and we found the similar decrease for both of those. So it doesn't seem to matter what you recall or what you say there. The length of the response also didn't moderate it, but just the act of doing it seems to be the key factor.
I just wonder what that act is doing mechanism-wise.
Yeah.
Accountability to yourself, kind of like you have to, yeah.
I think that's it. Let's give them a round of applause.